The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as 7-year-old Charlotte Williams clutched her mother's hand tightly. Her small fingers trembled not from the cool London air, but from the mixture of excitement and nervousness that filled her young heart. Today was supposed to be special, her first official visit to the palace with her mother, Sarah Williams, who worked as a senior curator for the Royal Collection Trust. Charlotte had been dreaming about this day for weeks. Her mother had finally received permission to bring her daughter along during a routine inspection of the palace's historical artifacts. Sarah had spent countless evenings preparing Charlotte for the visit, explaining the importance of proper behavior, the significance of the royal residence, and the deep respect required when in the presence of such historical grandeur. "Remember, sweetheart," Sarah whispered as they approached the ornate entrance, "we must be very quiet and respectful. This is a place where history lives and breathes." Charlotte nodded solemnly, her wide blue eyes taking in every detail of the magnificent building before her. The towering walls seemed to reach toward the sky, and the intricate carvings around the doorways looked like something from the fairy tales her mother read to her every night. She had never seen anything so grand and beautiful in her 7 years of life. As they entered through the staff entrance, Charlotte was immediately struck by the opulence that surrounded them. The hallways were lined with portraits of kings and queens from centuries past, their stern faces seeming to watch every visitor who dared to walk these sacred halls. Crystal chandeliers hung from elaborately decorated ceilings, casting rainbow patterns on the polished marble floors that reflected their images like mirrors. Sarah led her daughter through a series of corridors, pointing out various historical pieces along the way. "That painting there," she said, gesturing toward a massive canvas depicting a battle scene, "was commissioned by King George III in 1785. And this vase," she paused beside an ornate ceramic piece, "was a gift from the Emperor of China to Queen Victoria." Charlotte listened intently, trying to absorb every word her mother spoke. She felt like she was walking through a living museum, surrounded by treasures that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Each room they entered seemed more magnificent than the last, filled with furniture that looked too precious to touch and artwork that belonged in her most vivid dreams. The palace staff they encountered along the way were uniformly polite and professional. Charlotte noticed how they addressed her mother with respect, clearly recognizing her expertise and position within the organization. Sarah had worked tirelessly for 15 years to earn her current role, starting as a junior assistant and slowly climbing the ranks through dedication, extensive study, and genuine passion for preserving historical artifacts. As they made their way deeper into the palace, Charlotte began to notice the subtle hierarchies that existed within these walls. There were different types of staff members, some wore simple uniforms and kept their eyes downcast as they went about their duties, while others dressed in more elaborate attire and carried themselves with greater confidence. The royal guards, stationed at various strategic points throughout the building, stood at perfect attention, their red uniforms immaculate and their expressions stoic. "Mama," Charlotte whispered as they passed a particularly stern-looking guard, "do they ever smile?" Sarah chuckled softly. "They're working, darling. Their job is to protect this place and everyone in it. They take their responsibilities very seriously." The morning proceeded smoothly as Sarah conducted her inspection of several rooms containing priceless artifacts. Charlotte watched in fascination as her mother carefully examined delicate porcelain figurines, ancient manuscripts, and jewelry that had once adorned royal necks. Each piece was documented meticulously, with Sarah taking detailed notes and photographs for her reports. During their inspection of the blue drawing room, Charlotte found herself captivated by a particular painting of a young princess who appeared to be about her own age. The girl in the portrait wore an elaborate white dress with blue satin ribbons, and her expression held a mixture of innocence and regal bearing that Charlotte found mesmerizing. "Who is she, Mama?" Charlotte asked, pointing to the painting. "That's Princess Charlotte of Wales," Sarah replied, glancing up from her documentation. "She lived over 200 years ago and was beloved by the people. Sadly, she died very young, but she's remembered as someone who brought joy and hope to the nation." Charlotte stared at the painting for a long moment, feeling a strange connection to this long-dead princess who shared her name. There was something in the painted girl's eyes that seemed familiar, a spark of determination and kindness that Charlotte recognized in her own reflection. As the morning turned to afternoon, they made their way to one of the palace's smaller reception rooms where Sarah needed to examine a collection of rare books. The room was quieter than the others they had visited, with tall windows that allowed natural light to filter in through heavy velvet curtains. Charlotte settled into a chair near the window while her mother worked, content to watch the activity in the courtyard below. From her vantage point, Charlotte could see various palace staff members going about their duties. Gardeners tended to the immaculate flower beds, their movements careful and precise as they maintained the grounds to perfection. Delivery personnel brought supplies through designated entrances, their activities coordinated with military precision. Everything about palace life seemed to operate according to strict protocols and time-honored traditions. It was during this quiet observation period that Charlotte first noticed the tension building in the hallway outside their room. Voices were becoming slightly elevated, though still maintaining the professional tone expected within palace walls. She could hear her mother's name mentioned several times, along with phrases like proper authorization and established procedures. Sarah, engrossed in her examination of a particularly fragile manuscript, seemed unaware of the growing commotion outside. Charlotte debated whether to alert her mother but decided to wait and see if the situation would resolve itself naturally. She had been taught to be observant but not to interfere with adult matters unless absolutely necessary. The voices grew closer, and Charlotte could now make out distinct words and phrases. Someone was questioning Sarah's presence in certain areas of the palace, suggesting that she had exceeded her authorized access level. Another voice, one Charlotte didn't recognize, was defending the accusations with increasing firmness. Mrs. Williams has been granted full access to these areas for her inspection, the defending voice insisted. Her credentials are impeccable, and her work is essential to maintaining the integrity of the royal collection. That may be, came the reply, but protocols must be followed precisely. There can be no exceptions, regardless of tenure or reputation. Charlotte felt her stomach beginning to knot with anxiety. She could sense that something was wrong, even though she didn't fully understand the nature of the conflict. Her mother had always spoken with such pride about her work at the palace, describing it as both an honor and a responsibility that she took very seriously. The conversation outside their door suddenly stopped, and Charlotte heard footsteps approaching. The door opened slowly, and two men in palace administrative uniforms entered the room. Their expressions were serious but not unkind, and they approached Sarah with professional courtesy. Mrs. Williams, the elder of the two men, said, "We need to discuss some concerns that have been raised regarding your access authorization for today's inspection." Sarah looked up from her work, her expression immediately shifting from concentration to concern. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. All of my paperwork was submitted and approved weeks ago. I have copies of every authorization right here." She reached for her briefcase and began pulling out official documents, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the obvious stress she was feeling. Charlotte watched her mother's face carefully, noting the slight tremor in her voice and the way her shoulders had tensed. "The issue isn't with your standard authorizations," the second man explained. "It's regarding the presence of your daughter in areas that may not have been specifically approved for civilian visitors, particularly children." Charlotte felt her heart sink. She realized that she might be the cause of her mother's current difficulties, even though she had been given explicit permission to accompany Sarah on this visit. The thought that her presence might jeopardize her mother's career or reputation filled her with a deep sense of guilt and worry. Sarah's response was immediate and firm. "My daughter's presence was specifically requested and approved by the collections committee. I have the signed authorization right here." She produced another document from her briefcase, her voice gaining strength as she defended both her professionalism and her daughter's right to be there. The two men examined the paperwork carefully, their expressions remaining neutral as they reviewed each page. Charlotte could see that the documents appeared to be in order, with official seals and signatures clearly visible. She began to hope that this was simply a misunderstanding that would be quickly resolved. However, as the men continued their examination, Charlotte noticed that other staff members had begun to gather in the hallway outside the room. Some appeared to be curious about the commotion, while others seemed to be there in some official capacity. The situation was clearly becoming more complex than a simple clerical error. Mrs. Williams, the elder man said finally, while your documentation appears to be technically correct, there are concerns about the precedent this sets. Palace security protocols exist for very specific reasons, and exceptions, even well-documented ones, can create complications. Charlotte watched her mother's face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. Sarah had worked too hard and too long to have her professionalism questioned in this manner, especially in front of her daughter. The injustice of the situation was becoming increasingly clear, even to Charlotte's 7-year-old understanding. I understand your concerns about security, Sarah replied, her voice carefully controlled, but I've followed every protocol to the letter. My daughter is here under proper authorization, and I take full responsibility for her behavior and safety during our visit. The tension in the room was palpable as the two sides continued their discussion. Charlotte could see that her mother was fighting not just for her professional reputation, but for the principle of being treated fairly despite having done everything correctly. The situation was rapidly becoming a test of Sarah's standing within the palace hierarchy. As the debate continued, Charlotte noticed that more people had gathered outside the room. Among them, she could see the distinctive red uniform of a royal guard, standing at attention despite the unusual circumstances. Something about his presence seemed different from the other guards they had encountered during their visit. There was an alertness in his posture that suggested he was paying close attention to the developing situation. The afternoon sun was beginning to shift, casting different shadows across the room as the discussion dragged on. Charlotte remained quiet in her chair by the window, but her young mind was working furiously to understand the complexities of what she was witnessing. She could see that this was about more than just paperwork or protocols. It was about respect, fairness, and the way people treated each other when power dynamics came into play. Her mother had taught her about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. Sarah had always emphasized the importance of integrity, hard work, and treating others with dignity regardless of their position or status. Now Charlotte was watching her mother put those principles into practice under very challenging circumstances. The conversation was reaching a critical point when Charlotte made a decision that would change everything. She could no longer sit quietly while her mother's integrity and professionalism were being questioned unfairly. Despite her young age and the intimidating surroundings, she felt compelled to act. The lessons her mother had taught her about courage and standing up for what was right suddenly seemed more important than any protocol or expectation about children remaining silent. As Charlotte prepared to speak, she had no idea that her next actions would create a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The royal guard standing in the hallway had been listening carefully to every word of the discussion, and something about the situation had captured his attention in a way that would soon become apparent to everyone present. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only Charlotte's courage but also reveal the true character of those around her. In that moment, surrounded by centuries of royal history and tradition, a 7-year-old girl was about to make a stand that would resonate far beyond the ornate walls of Buckingham Palace. Charlotte rose slowly from her chair by the window, her small hands smoothing down her navy blue dress that her mother had carefully selected for this special occasion. Every eye in the room turned toward her as she walked across the polished marble floor, her footsteps barely audible but somehow commanding attention from everyone present. The 7-year-old girl who had been quietly observing from the sidelines was about to step into a situation that would test her courage in ways she had never imagined. "Excuse me," Charlotte said, her voice clear and steady despite the trembling she felt inside. The room fell silent, with even the administrative officials pausing their discussion to look down at this small figure who had suddenly inserted herself into their serious conversation. Sarah looked at her daughter with a mixture of surprise and concern. She had taught Charlotte to be respectful and to speak up when necessary, but this was hardly the time or place she had envisioned for such a lesson to be put into practice. The palace setting, the official nature of the discussion, and the potential consequences for both of their futures made this moment particularly fraught with tension. "Charlotte, sweetheart," Sarah began gently, "please return to your seat. The adults need to finish their conversation." But Charlotte had made her decision, and something deep inside her 7-year-old heart told her that this was exactly the right time to speak. She had watched her mother work with dedication and passion for years, had heard countless stories about the importance of preserving history and treating priceless artifacts with the reverence they deserved. She had seen her mother's face light up when discussing her work, and she had witnessed firsthand the respect that Sarah's colleagues had for her expertise and professionalism. "I want to say something about my mama," Charlotte announced, looking directly at the two administrative officials who had been questioning her mother's authorization. Her blue eyes, so similar to Sarah's, held a determination that surprised everyone in the room. The elder of the two men looked uncomfortable with this unexpected development. Protocol certainly didn't include provisions for children participating in official discussions, and he seemed uncertain about how to proceed. However, something about Charlotte's earnest expression and the respectful way she had inserted herself into the conversation prevented him from immediately dismissing her words. "Young lady," he said carefully, "this is a very serious adult matter that requires our full attention. Perhaps you could wait outside while we finish our discussion with your mother." Charlotte shook her head firmly but politely. "No, sir. I need to tell you about my mama because I don't think you understand how special she is and how hard she works for this place." The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Charlotte continued. "My mama loves the palace and all the beautiful things in it more than anything except me. She studies every night after I go to bed, reading big books about history and art. She practices saying hard words so she can explain things perfectly. She even dreams about paintings and old dishes sometimes." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she listened to her daughter's words. She had no idea that Charlotte had been paying such close attention to her work habits and professional dedication. The child's observations were remarkably accurate and delivered with a sincerity that was impossible to dismiss. "Every morning before we leave the house," Charlotte continued, gaining confidence as she spoke, "my mama makes sure her clothes are perfect because she says she represents something important when she comes here. She tells me that taking care of history is like being a guardian angel for all the people who lived before us." One of the administrative officials shifted uncomfortably, beginning to realize that their questioning of Sarah's professionalism was being witnessed and evaluated by someone whose perspective, while young, was surprisingly perceptive. Charlotte's words were painting a picture of dedication and respect that contradicted any suggestion of carelessness or protocol violations. "She never, ever does anything that might hurt or damage the beautiful things here," Charlotte said, her voice growing stronger. "When she brought me today, she made me promise 100 times to be careful and quiet and respectful. She told me that being allowed to come here was a great honor that not many little girls get to have." The royal guard who had been standing in the hallway moved slightly closer to the doorway, his attention clearly focused on Charlotte's words. His expression remained professionally neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was evaluating not just what was being said, but the character of the people involved in this unusual situation. Charlotte turned to look directly at her mother, and everyone in the room could see the love and admiration shining in her young face. "My mama didn't bring me here to cause problems. She brought me here because she wanted me to understand how important her work is and how much she respects this place. She wanted me to see why she works so hard every day." Sarah felt her heart swelling with pride at her daughter's words, but also with concern about the potential consequences of this unexpected intervention. She had always encouraged Charlotte to be honest and brave, but she had never anticipated that those lessons would be put to the test in such a high-stakes situation. "Charlotte is right," Sarah said quietly, finding her voice again. "I brought her here today because I wanted her to understand the importance of preserving history and the responsibility that comes with being trusted to care for irreplaceable artifacts. Every decision I made about today's visit was guided by that sense of responsibility." The administrative officials exchanged glances, clearly struggling with how to respond to this emotionally charged testimony from a 7-year-old. The situation had moved far beyond simple protocol verification and had become something much more complex, a question of character, integrity, and the true meaning of professional dedication. Charlotte wasn't finished, however. She had more to say, and the adults in the room seemed to recognize that she deserved to be heard completely before any decisions were made. "My mama works really, really hard," Charlotte continued, her small hands gesturing expressively as she spoke. "Sometimes when I wake up at night, I see the light under her door because she's still studying. She wants to know everything about the things she takes care of so she can protect them properly." The second administrative official, who had been largely silent during Charlotte's speech, cleared his throat. "We're not questioning your mother's dedication or competence," he said carefully. Our concerns are simply about following established procedures to ensure the security and safety of the palace and its contents. Charlotte looked at him with the directness that only children possess. But my mama did follow all the procedures. She showed you all the papers, and they have the right stamps and signatures. Why are you still saying she did something wrong? The question hung in the air like a challenge that none of the adults seemed prepared to answer directly. Charlotte had identified the core issue with a clarity that cut through all the bureaucratic language and protocol discussions. If Sarah had proper authorization, which the paperwork clearly indicated she did, then what exactly was the problem? Sometimes, the elder official said slowly, even when procedures are technically followed, there can be additional considerations that need to be evaluated. Charlotte frowned, clearly struggling to understand this explanation. That doesn't seem fair, she said simply. If my mama did everything right, why is she being treated like she did something wrong? The royal guard in the hallway had moved closer still, and Sarah noticed that his attention seemed completely focused on Charlotte's words and the way she was defending her mother. There was something in his posture that suggested he was not merely observing but actively evaluating the situation from his own professional perspective. Young lady, the elder official said, his tone becoming slightly more patronizing, adult situations are often more complicated than they appear to children. There are many factors that you might not understand. This response seemed to spark something in Charlotte's 7-year-old sense of justice. Her cheeks flushed slightly, and her voice took on a firmer quality that surprised everyone present. I may be little, but I'm not stupid, she said with dignity that seemed far beyond her years. I can see when someone is being treated unfairly, and I can tell when grown-ups are making something more complicated than it needs to be. Sarah felt a surge of protective instinct mixed with profound pride in her daughter's courage. Charlotte was displaying exactly the kind of moral backbone that Sarah had always hoped to instill in her, but seeing it in action in such circumstances was both thrilling and terrifying. Charlotte, please, Sarah said gently, let me handle this situation. But Charlotte turned to her mother with an expression of fierce loyalty that touched everyone who witnessed it. No, Mama. You've been handling everything perfectly, but they're still not listening to you. Sometimes when grown-ups won't listen to grown-ups, maybe they need to listen to a little girl instead. The room fell silent again as the profound truth of Charlotte's words sank in. The administrative officials found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having their behavior evaluated and found wanting by a child whose observations were uncomfortably accurate. My mama has never done anything to hurt this place or the beautiful things in it, Charlotte continued, her voice clear and unwavering. She loves them and takes better care of them than she takes care of herself sometimes. She deserves to be trusted and respected, not questioned like she's a bad person who might do something wrong. The royal guard had now moved to where he was clearly visible in the doorway, though he maintained his professional posture and remained silent. However, his presence had become more prominent, and Sarah began to sense that something significant was developing beyond the immediate conflict with the administrative staff. Charlotte walked closer to the two officials, looking up at them with an expression that combined innocence with remarkable determination. I want you to apologize to my mama, she said simply. She didn't do anything wrong, and you've made her feel bad when she should feel proud of her work and happy about sharing this special place with me. The boldness of this request from a 7-year-old left the adults speechless for several moments. Children simply didn't make demands of palace officials, regardless of the circumstances or the validity of their observations. Yet Charlotte had done exactly that, and she stood waiting for their response with the patience and confidence of someone who believed completely in the rightness of her position. The elder official looked distinctly uncomfortable as he processed Charlotte's request. The situation had evolved far beyond anything covered in standard protocol manuals, and he found himself uncertain about how to proceed. The child's arguments were logically sound, her observations were accurate, and her defense of her mother's integrity was both touching and compelling. Young lady, he began slowly, the situation is perhaps more nuanced than you realize. Charlotte's response was immediate and direct. What does nuanced mean? The official paused, clearly struggling to explain adult bureaucratic complexities to a child who was asking for simple fairness and justice. It means that there are aspects of the situation that are difficult to explain simply. Then, maybe those aspects aren't as important as being fair to my mama, Charlotte replied with logic that was hard to argue against. The royal guard in the doorway shifted slightly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something in his expression that suggested he was impressed by Charlotte's reasoning and touched by her loyalty. His professional training required him to remain neutral and silent, but his human response to the scene unfolding before him was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. Charlotte seemed to sense that she had reached a crucial moment in her defense of her mother. Everything she had learned about courage, integrity, and standing up for what was right was being put to the test in this ornate room filled with centuries of royal history. Her next words would either strengthen her position or potentially create more difficulties for both her mother and herself. "Please," Charlotte said, her voice carrying a quiet dignity that commanded respect, "just treat my mama fairly. That's all I'm asking. She's a good person who works really hard, and she doesn't deserve to be made to feel like she's done something wrong when she hasn't." The sincerity and maturity of this plea seemed to penetrate the bureaucratic armor that the officials had been maintaining throughout their discussion. They were faced with a child who had articulated a simple but powerful argument for basic fairness and human decency, and their continued resistance was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. As the tension in the room reached its peak, the royal guard who had been observing from the doorway suddenly stepped forward, bringing with him a presence and authority that would transform the entire situation in ways that no one present could have anticipated. The royal guard who stepped into the room carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent years in service to the crown. His red uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, and his posture spoke of decades of military discipline and unwavering dedication to duty. But there was something else in his demeanor as he entered the room, a quality that suggested he had been deeply moved by what he had witnessed from the hallway. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the authority that came with his position while remaining respectfully courteous to all present. "I couldn't help but overhear the discussion, and I believe there may be some additional information that should be considered." The two administrative officials immediately straightened, recognizing the seniority that the guard's uniform and bearing represented. Sarah felt her heart race, uncertain whether this new development would help or complicate their already difficult situation. Charlotte, however, looked up at the guard with curiosity rather than fear, her instincts telling her that this man might be different from the others who had been questioning her mother's integrity. "Guard Captain Morrison," the elder official said, reading the name badge with obvious respect, "we're handling a routine authorization verification. I'm not sure additional input is necessary." Captain Morrison's weathered face showed the slightest hint of a smile as he looked down at Charlotte, who was still standing bravely in the center of the room. "With respect, sir, I don't believe there's anything routine about what I've just witnessed. This young lady has demonstrated a level of character and loyalty that deserves recognition, not dismissal." Charlotte felt a warmth spread through her chest at the guard's words. For the first time since the confrontation began, someone in authority was acknowledging that her defense of her mother had value and meaning. She straightened her small shoulders, feeling vindicated in her decision to speak up. "I've been stationed at this palace for 23 years, Captain Morrison continued, his gaze moving between the administrative officials and Charlotte's upturned face. "I've seen thousands of visitors, staff members, and dignitaries pass through these halls. But rarely have I witnessed such a pure display of integrity and courage as what this child has shown today." Sarah felt tears threatening to overflow as she listened to the guard's words. The stress and humiliation of the past hour had taken an emotional toll, but this unexpected support from someone she had never met was almost overwhelming in its kindness and understanding. "Captain Morrison," the second official interjected, "while we appreciate your observations, our responsibility is to ensure that palace protocols are followed precisely. Personal sentiments, however admirable, cannot supersede security requirements." The captain's expression remained respectful but firm. "I understand your concerns about protocol, sir. However, I've also observed Mrs. Williams during her work here over many years. Her professionalism and dedication to preserving our royal heritage is exemplary. More importantly, the way this young lady has defended her mother's character tells me everything I need to know about the values that guide their family." Charlotte looked up at Captain Morrison with growing admiration. Here was someone who understood what she had been trying to explain, that her mother's worth should be measured by her actions and character, not by bureaucratic interpretations of paperwork that was clearly in order. You see, the captain continued, addressing Charlotte directly, in my years of service, I've learned that true honor isn't just about following rules blindly. It's about recognizing character, integrity, and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. You've shown all of those qualities today, young miss. The administrative officials exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly realizing that the situation had shifted significantly with Captain Morrison's intervention. They were no longer dealing with just a staff member and her child, but with someone whose authority within the palace hierarchy exceeded their own. I've been listening to this discussion for some time, Captain Morrison said, his tone becoming more official, and I must say that I'm troubled by what I've heard. Mrs. Williams presented proper authorization, conducted herself professionally, and has a spotless record of service to this institution. Yet she's been subjected to questioning that seems to go beyond reasonable verification procedures. Charlotte felt a surge of vindication at the captain's words. Finally, someone in authority was acknowledging what had seemed so obvious to her 7-year-old sense of fairness, that her mother was being treated unjustly despite having done everything correctly. Furthermore, the captain continued, this young lady has demonstrated exactly the kind of character that we should hope to see in all visitors to this palace. She has shown respect for the institution, loyalty to her family, and the courage to speak up for what she believes is right. These are qualities that should be praised, not discouraged. Sarah wiped away a tear as she listened to Captain Morrison's defense of both her professionalism and Charlotte's courage. The kindness and understanding he was showing felt like a beacon of hope in what had been an increasingly dark situation. The elder administrative official cleared his throat nervously. Captain Morrison, we certainly don't wish to be unreasonable. However, there have been some concerns raised about setting precedents that might compromise security protocols in the future. Whose concerns? Captain Morrison asked directly. And, based on what evidence of any security compromise or protocol violation? The question hung in the air as the officials struggled to provide a substantive answer. It was becoming increasingly clear that their objections were based more on bureaucratic caution than on any actual problems with Sarah's authorization or conduct. Charlotte, emboldened by Captain Morrison's support, stepped forward slightly. The captain is right, she said with growing confidence. My mama and I haven't done anything wrong, and you've been making her feel terrible for no good reason. Captain Morrison looked down at Charlotte with unmistakable admiration. Miss Charlotte, he said formally, your loyalty to your mother and your courage in speaking up for what you believe is right are truly remarkable. You remind me of another young lady who once walked these halls, someone who also wasn't afraid to stand up for what she believed was just and fair. Who was she? Charlotte asked, her curiosity overriding the tension of the moment. Princess Charlotte of Wales, the captain replied, his voice carrying a note of reverence. She lived long ago, but she was known for her strong sense of justice and her willingness to defend those who were being treated unfairly. Just like you did today. Charlotte's eyes widened as she realized that the captain was comparing her to the princess in the painting she had admired earlier, the girl with the kind eyes and determined expression who shared her name. The connection felt magical and empowering, as if she was part of a tradition of courage that stretched back through the centuries. The princess was beloved by the people because she had a good heart and wasn't afraid to do the right thing, even when it was difficult, Captain Morrison continued. Those same qualities shine through in your actions today. Sarah felt her heart swelling with pride as she watched her daughter absorb these words. The captain was not only defending their position but also helping Charlotte understand that her actions connected her to something larger and more meaningful than just this particular confrontation. The administrative officials were clearly struggling with how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. Captain Morrison's authority within the palace hierarchy was considerable, and his public support for Charlotte and Sarah had fundamentally changed the dynamics of the situation. Captain Morrison, the elder official said carefully, if you're satisfied with the authorization and conduct involved, then perhaps we can consider this matter resolved. But Captain Morrison wasn't finished. He had been moved by Charlotte's display of character in a way that went beyond simple professional courtesy, and he wanted to ensure that this moment received the recognition it deserved. Actually, he said, his voice taking on a more formal tone, I believe this situation calls for something more significant than simple resolution. He turned to face Charlotte directly, and everyone in the room sensed that something important was about to happen. The captain's demeanor had shifted to one of ceremonial gravity, as if he was preparing to perform an official act rather than simply offering support. Miss Charlotte Williams, he said, his voice carrying the weight of formal recognition, your actions today have exemplified the highest ideals of courage, loyalty, and integrity. You have defended your mother's honor with dignity and grace, and you have shown that age is no barrier to moral courage. Charlotte stood very still, sensing the importance of the moment even though she didn't fully understand what was happening. The captain's formal tone and bearing suggested that something significant was taking place, something that went beyond the immediate resolution of their difficulties. In my 23 years of service at this palace, Captain Morrison continued, I have witnessed many acts of duty and dedication. But rarely have I seen such a pure example of character as you have demonstrated today. You have honored not only your mother and your family, but also the very ideals that this institution represents. The room had fallen completely silent as everyone present recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Royal guards did not typically make such formal speeches to visitors, especially children, and the gravity of Captain Morrison's words suggested that Charlotte's actions had touched him in a profound way. Therefore, the captain said, his posture straightening to full military attention, I believe your courage and character deserve formal recognition. What happened next would become the moment that everyone in that room would remember and talk about for years to come. Captain Morrison, with the precision and gravity that came from decades of military service, raised his right hand in a formal military salute directed at 7-year-old Charlotte Williams. The gesture was unprecedented, unexpected, and profoundly moving. A senior royal guard, representing centuries of tradition and service to the crown, was offering the same respect and recognition to a small child that he would typically reserve for visiting dignitaries and members of the royal family themselves. Charlotte's eyes widened in amazement as she realized that this impressive man in his beautiful red uniform was saluting her, not her mother, not the officials, but her specifically, in recognition of her courage and loyalty. The moment felt surreal and magical, as if she had stepped into one of the fairy tales her mother read to her at bedtime. Sarah gasped audibly, her hands flying to her mouth as she witnessed this extraordinary gesture. She had never seen anything like it in all her years of working at the palace, and she understood instinctively that this was a moment that would be remembered long after the bureaucratic details of today's confrontation were forgotten. The administrative officials stood frozen, clearly uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented display. Protocol manuals provided no guidance for situations where senior palace guards offered formal military salutes to visiting children, regardless of the circumstances that had led to such a moment. Captain Morrison held his salute for several long seconds, his eyes meeting Charlotte's with unmistakable respect and admiration. In that moment, he was not just acknowledging her courage, but also sending a message to everyone present about the values that truly mattered within the walls of this historic institution. When he finally lowered his hand, the silence in the room continued for several more moments as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, a smile spread across Charlotte's face, not the simple happiness of a child who had received a pleasant surprise, but the deeper satisfaction of someone who had been truly seen and recognized for who she was and what she had done. Thank you, Captain Morrison, Charlotte said with the same dignity she had displayed throughout her defense of her mother. That was the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me. The captain smiled warmly in return. No, Miss Charlotte. Thank you for reminding all of us what courage and loyalty look like when they come from the heart. News of what had happened in the blue drawing room spread through Buckingham Palace with remarkable speed. Within hours of Captain Morrison's unprecedented salute to 7-year-old Charlotte Williams, staff members throughout the building were discussing the extraordinary scene that had unfolded. The story grew and evolved with each telling, but the core elements remained consistent. A young child had courageously defended her mother's honor, and a senior royal guard had been so moved by her character that he had offered her a formal military salute. By evening, the tale had reached the upper echelons of palace administration, including several members of the royal household staff who had never heard of such a thing happening in their decades of service. The unprecedented nature of the gesture, combined with the compelling circumstances that had led to it, created a buzz of conversation that extended far beyond the usual palace gossip. Charlotte, meanwhile, had returned home with her mother in a state of excited bewilderment. The day had begun with nervous anticipation about visiting the palace, had descended into confusion and distress over the bureaucratic confrontation, and had culminated in an experience that felt like something from a fairy tale. She struggled to process everything that had happened, but one thing remained crystal clear in her young mind: she had done the right thing by standing up for her mother. "Mama," Charlotte said as they sat together at their small kitchen table that evening, sharing a simple dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, "why did Captain Morrison salute me? I'm just a little girl." Sarah set down her spoon and looked at her daughter with eyes that still held traces of the tears she had shed throughout the day. "Because, sweetheart, you showed him something very special today. You showed him what it looks like when someone fights for what's right, even when they're scared." "I was scared," Charlotte admitted, stirring her soup thoughtfully. "But I couldn't let those men keep being mean to you when you hadn't done anything wrong." "That's exactly why the captain was so impressed," Sarah explained, reaching across the table to stroke Charlotte's hair. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared." As they continued their quiet dinner, Sarah's phone began ringing repeatedly. Colleagues from the Royal Collection Trust were calling to express their support and amazement at what they had heard. Word of the incident had reached their offices, and the consensus was unanimous: Sarah had been treated unfairly, and Charlotte had shown remarkable maturity and courage in her defense. "Mrs. Williams," said Dr. Margaret Thornberry, the Trust's director, when Sarah finally answered one of the calls. "I've just heard about what happened today, and I want you to know that the entire organization stands behind you. Your authorization was completely proper, and the questioning you received was unwarranted." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as she listened to her supervisor's words. The professional validation meant more to her than she could express, especially after a day that had left her questioning her own judgment and standing within the organization. "More importantly," Dr. Thornberry continued, "I understand that your daughter conducted herself with remarkable dignity throughout the ordeal. The reports I'm receiving describe behavior that would be admirable in an adult, let alone a 7-year-old child." The next morning brought even more unexpected developments. Sarah's phone rang early, and she was surprised to hear the voice of Captain Morrison on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Williams," he said formally, "I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to speak with you about yesterday's events and their aftermath." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, uncertain whether this call would bring good news or complications. "Of course, Captain Morrison. How can I help you?" "Actually, it's more a matter of how I might be able to help you and your daughter," the captain replied, his tone warming slightly. "The story of what happened yesterday has attracted some attention from higher levels of palace administration, and there are some people who would very much like to meet Miss Charlotte." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process this information. What kind of attention? Are we in some sort of trouble? Captain Morrison chuckled softly. "Quite the opposite, I assure you. When word of your daughter's courage and character reached certain offices, it generated a great deal of admiration and interest. There's a desire to recognize her actions in a more formal way." "I don't understand," Sarah said, sinking into a kitchen chair as Charlotte looked up at her with curious eyes. "Mrs. Williams, what your daughter did yesterday was truly extraordinary. She stood up for what was right with a level of courage and dignity that impressed everyone who witnessed it. That kind of character deserves recognition, and there are people in positions of authority who agree with that assessment." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and anxiety as she listened to the captain's words. While she was thrilled that Charlotte's actions were being appreciated, she was also concerned about unwanted attention or expectations that might be placed on her young daughter. "What kind of recognition are we talking about?" Sarah asked carefully. "Nothing that would be burdensome or inappropriate for a child," Captain Morrison assured her. "But there is interest in arranging a proper meeting where Charlotte could be thanked formally for her demonstration of character and courage." As Sarah continued her conversation with Captain Morrison, Charlotte finished her breakfast and went to her room to get ready for school. She had homework to complete and spelling words to practice, the normal routine of a 7-year-old's life that seemed almost surreal after the extraordinary events of the previous day. At school, Charlotte found it difficult to concentrate on her lessons. Mrs. Patterson, her teacher, noticed that she seemed distracted and asked if everything was all right. "I went to Buckingham Palace yesterday," Charlotte said simply, as if such visits were a normal part of her weekly routine. Mrs. Patterson smiled indulgently, assuming that Charlotte was either exaggerating or describing some sort of tourist visit. "That sounds lovely, dear. Did you see the guards in their red uniforms?" "Yes, and one of them saluted me," Charlotte replied matter-of-factly. The teacher's smile became slightly strained as she tried to determine whether Charlotte was telling the truth or engaging in the kind of creative storytelling that was common among children her age. The claim seemed too extraordinary to be real, yet Charlotte's tone suggested she was being completely serious. During lunch break, Charlotte found herself surrounded by classmates who were eager to hear more about her palace adventure. As she recounted the events of the previous day, embellishing nothing but struggling to make the incredible story believable, her friends listened with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. "Did you really tell off the palace people?" asked Emma, one of Charlotte's closest friends. "I didn't tell them off," Charlotte corrected patiently. "I just explained why they were being unfair to my mama." "And a Real Guard really saluted you," pressed another classmate. "Captain Morrison," Charlotte said, her eyes lighting up at the memory. "He said I reminded him of a princess who used to live at the palace long ago." The children's reaction to Charlotte's story was typical of young people faced with something outside their normal experience. They wanted to believe her, but the tale seemed too much like a fairy story to be completely real. Charlotte didn't mind their skepticism. She knew what had happened, and that was enough for her. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Captain Morrison was having his own series of conversations about the previous day's events. His colleagues in the guard were curious about his unprecedented decision to salute a visiting child, and he found himself explaining and defending his actions repeatedly. "It's not as if I planned it," he told Sergeant Williams during their afternoon briefing. "But when I witnessed that little girl's courage and the way she defended her mother's integrity, I was genuinely moved. In 23 years of service, I've seen plenty of impressive displays of duty and honor, but rarely from someone so young." Still, the sergeant replied carefully, "Saluting civilians isn't exactly standard protocol, especially children." Captain Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, of course. But sometimes standard protocol isn't adequate to address extraordinary circumstances. That child demonstrated the kind of character that our service is meant to protect and honor. How could I do less than acknowledge that?" The conversation was interrupted by an aide who informed Captain Morrison that he was requested for a meeting with senior palace administrators. As he made his way through the familiar corridors, he reflected on the unusual position he found himself in. He had acted on instinct and emotion, moved by a 7-year-old's display of courage, and now he would need to explain and justify those actions to his superiors. The meeting room he entered contained several high-ranking officials, including some he recognized and others whose faces were new to him. The atmosphere was formal but not hostile, suggesting that he was there for discussion rather than discipline. "Captain Morrison," began a distinguished gentleman whom the captain recognized as Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, Deputy Master of the Household, "we've asked you here to discuss yesterday's incident involving the Williams family." "Yes, sir," Captain Morrison replied, standing at attention. "We understand that you intervened in what was essentially an administrative matter and that you subsequently offered a formal military salute to a 7-year-old visitor. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir, it is." Sir Geoffrey leaned back in his chair, studying the captain's face carefully. "That's quite an unusual action, Captain. Can you help us understand what motivated such a decision?" Captain Morrison had spent considerable time preparing for this moment, knowing that he would need to articulate clearly why he had felt compelled to act as he did. "Sir, I witnessed a remarkable display of character and courage from a child who was defending her mother's integrity against what appeared to be unfair treatment. The young lady conducted herself with a level of dignity and moral clarity that I found genuinely inspiring." "Even so," another official interjected, "military protocol exists for specific reasons. Salutes are reserved for particular circumstances and individuals." "With respect, sir," Captain Morrison replied, I believe that true honor and courage deserve recognition regardless of the age or status of the person displaying them. That little girl demonstrated qualities that we should hope to see in all citizens: loyalty, integrity, and the willingness to stand up for what's right even in difficult circumstances." Sir Geoffrey exchanged glances with his colleagues before continuing. "Captain Morrison, your service record is exemplary, and your judgment has always been sound. However, this incident has generated considerable discussion, both within palace walls and beyond." The captain felt a flutter of concern. "Has there been criticism of my actions, sir?" "Actually, quite the opposite," Sir Geoffrey replied, a slight smile appearing on his face. "The consensus among those who have heard the story is that your recognition of the young lady's character was entirely appropriate and rather touching." Captain Morrison felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had been prepared to defend his actions regardless of the consequences, but knowing that his superiors understood and approved made the situation much more comfortable. "In fact," Sir Geoffrey continued, "we've been discussing ways to build upon your initial recognition of Miss Charlotte's actions. There's a feeling that such remarkable character in someone so young deserves more formal acknowledgement." "What did you have in mind, sir?" the captain asked. "We're still working out the details, but we're considering arranging a proper ceremony where Miss Charlotte could be thanked officially for her demonstration of courage and integrity. It would be unprecedented, but then, again, so were the circumstances that brought her to our attention." Captain Morrison smiled broadly. "I think that would be wonderful, sir. She's a remarkable young lady who deserves every bit of recognition we might offer." As the meeting concluded, Captain Morrison left feeling validated in his decision to salute Charlotte and excited about the possibility that her courage might receive even greater recognition. He had acted on instinct and emotion, but that instinct had apparently aligned perfectly with the values and traditions that his service represented. The wheels were now in motion for something that had never happened before in the long history of Buckingham Palace: a formal ceremony to honor the character and courage of a 7-year-old girl who had simply stood up for what she believed was right. The story that had begun with a routine palace visit was evolving into something that would touch hearts and inspire conversations about courage, integrity, and the power of standing up for others, regardless of one's age or position. 3 weeks after that remarkable day in the Blue Drawing Room, Charlotte Williams found herself once again walking through the gates of Buckingham Palace, but this time the circumstances were entirely different. She wore her finest dress, a navy blue velvet outfit that her mother had purchased especially for this occasion, and her hair was arranged in careful curls that bounced slightly as she walked. In her small hands, she carried a white envelope that contained something she had never seen before: a formal invitation from the royal household. Sarah walked beside her daughter, equally well dressed but visibly nervous about what lay ahead. The phone call from Sir Geoffrey Hartwell had been both thrilling and intimidating. The deputy master of the household had personally invited Charlotte to attend a small ceremony in recognition of her demonstration of character and courage. The invitation was unprecedented in palace history, but so had been the circumstances that led to it. "Remember, sweetheart," Sarah whispered as they approached the main entrance, "this is a very special honor. Just be yourself, and speak clearly when anyone asks you a question." Charlotte nodded solemnly, but inside she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that made her stomach flutter like butterfly wings. She understood that something important was happening, even if she couldn't fully grasp the magnitude of the recognition she was about to receive. They were met at the entrance by Captain Morrison, who was dressed in his finest ceremonial uniform. The red fabric seemed even more vibrant than Charlotte remembered, and the gold braiding caught the morning sunlight in a way that made him look like something from a storybook about knights and castles. "Miss Charlotte," he said with a warm smile, offering her a formal but gentle bow. "It's wonderful to see you again. Are you ready for your special day?" Charlotte smiled back at him, feeling immediately more comfortable in the presence of the man who had shown her such kindness and respect during their first encounter. "Yes, Captain Morrison. Mama says you helped arrange this celebration." "I was honored to be asked to help," he replied, his eyes twinkling with genuine affection. "What you did that day touched many hearts, and people wanted to make sure you knew how special your actions were." As they walked through the palace corridors, Charlotte noticed that staff members they passed seemed to recognize her. Several offered respectful nods or warm smiles, and she began to realize that her story had spread far beyond the small group of people who had witnessed her defense of her mother. They were led to the state drawing room, a magnificent space that Charlotte had never seen during her previous visit. The room was smaller than some of the palace's grander chambers, but it radiated an intimate elegance that made the occasion feel both formal and personal. Tall windows allowed natural light to illuminate portraits of historical figures, and fresh flowers had been arranged throughout the space in a way that suggested careful preparation for something special. Several distinguished-looking individuals were already present, including Dr. Margaret Thornberry from the Royal Collection Trust, Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, and several other palace officials whom Charlotte didn't recognize. They all turned toward her as she entered, and she noticed that their expressions held the same warmth and respect that Captain Morrison had shown her. "Miss Charlotte," Sir Geoffrey said, stepping forward with the dignity befitting his position, "welcome back to Buckingham Palace. We are delighted to have this opportunity to thank you properly for your remarkable demonstration of courage and character." Charlotte looked around the room with wide eyes, taking in the formal setting and the serious but friendly faces surrounding her. Everything about the moment felt important and significant, like something that would be remembered for years to come. "Before we begin our ceremony," Sir Geoffrey continued, "there's someone very special who would like to meet you." Charlotte felt her heart skip a beat as she noticed that everyone in the room had turned their attention toward a doorway at the far end of the chamber. She wasn't sure what to expect, but something in the atmosphere suggested that whatever was about to happen would be the most remarkable part of an already extraordinary day. The door opened slowly, and a figure entered who took Charlotte's breath away. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, walked into the room with the grace and dignity that came from a lifetime of royal duties and public service. She was dressed in an elegant blue suit that complemented Charlotte's own navy dress, and her expression held a warmth that immediately put the young girl at ease. Charlotte had seen pictures of Princess Anne in books and on television, but she had never imagined that she might actually meet a real princess. The realization that this distinguished lady had come specifically to meet her felt almost too incredible to believe. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Geoffrey said formally, "may I present Miss Charlotte Williams and her mother, Mrs. Sarah Williams." Sarah curtsied gracefully, having practiced the gesture repeatedly at home, while Charlotte attempted her own small curtsy with the careful concentration of someone trying to remember everything she had been taught about proper etiquette. Princess Anne smiled warmly at both of them, then knelt down to Charlotte's eye level in a gesture that immediately broke through any remaining barriers of formality and intimidation. "Charlotte," she said in a voice that was both regal and genuinely kind, "I've heard remarkable things about your courage and loyalty. I wanted to meet you personally to tell you how impressed I am with your actions." Charlotte found her voice, though it came out slightly higher than usual due to her excitement. "Your Royal Highness, I just didn't want those men to be mean to my mama when she hadn't done anything wrong." Princess Anne's smile grew even warmer. "And that, my dear, is exactly what makes your actions so special. You stood up for what was right because it was the right thing to do, not because you expected any reward or recognition. That's the mark of true character." The princess rose and addressed the assembled group. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's not often that we have the privilege of recognizing such pure moral courage, especially in someone so young. Charlotte's actions remind us all of the importance of standing up for justice and defending those we love, regardless of our age or position." Sir Geoffrey stepped forward with a small, elegant box in his hands. "Miss Charlotte," he said formally, "by direction of Her Majesty's household and in recognition of your extraordinary demonstration of courage, loyalty, and moral character, we would like to present you with this special token of appreciation." Charlotte looked up at her mother, who nodded encouragingly, then stepped forward to receive the box. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was a small silver medallion engraved with the royal coat of arms and her name. Below her name were the words "for courage and character" and the date of her brave defense of her mother. "This medallion," Princess Anne explained, "is unique. It was created specifically for you, and no one else will ever receive one exactly like it. It represents not just our appreciation for what you did, but our hope that you will continue to show such courage and integrity throughout your life." Charlotte lifted the medallion carefully from its box, feeling the weight of both the silver and the significance of what it represented. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness." I will treasure it always and remember what it means." Captain Morrison stepped forward at this point, and Charlotte noticed that he was carrying something as well. "Miss Charlotte," he said with the same formal respect he had shown her during their first encounter, "I have something else for you, with the permission of Her Royal Highness." He presented Charlotte with a beautifully framed photograph of the moment when he had saluted her in the blue drawing room. Someone had captured that unprecedented instant when a senior royal guard had offered formal military recognition to a 7-year-old girl who had shown remarkable courage. "This photograph will hang in the guardroom," Captain Morrison explained, "as a reminder to all who serve here about what true honor and courage look like. But we wanted you to have a copy as well, so you'll always remember that your actions touched hearts and inspired others." Charlotte studied the photograph with amazement. There she was, looking small but determined, while Captain Morrison offered his respectful salute. The image captured perfectly the moment when her courage had been recognized and validated by someone whose opinion carried great weight and authority. Princess Anne then did something that surprised everyone present, including the palace officials who had helped arrange the ceremony. She asked Charlotte to sit with her on one of the elegant sofas so they could have a more personal conversation. "Tell me, Charlotte," the princess said as they settled into the comfortable furniture, "what was going through your mind when you decided to speak up for your mother?" Charlotte considered the question carefully, wanting to give an honest answer to someone who had shown her such respect and kindness. "I kept thinking about all the stories Mama tells me about being brave and doing the right thing, even when it's scary. She always says that good people help each other and don't let unfair things happen when they can stop them." Princess Anne nodded thoughtfully. "Your mother has taught you well. It's one thing to learn about courage in stories, but it's quite another to show courage when it really matters. You did something that day that many adults would have been afraid to do." "I was afraid," Charlotte admitted honestly. "But I was more afraid of letting those men make my mama feel bad when she works so hard and cares so much about the beautiful things in the palace." "That," Princess Anne said with evident admiration, "is exactly the right kind of fear to overcome. When we're more concerned about others than we are about ourselves, that's when real heroism happens." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Princess Anne asking Charlotte about her school, her interests, and her dreams for the future. The princess shared stories about her own childhood at the palace and the lessons she had learned about service, duty, and the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. As the formal ceremony concluded, Charlotte found herself surrounded by well-wishers who wanted to congratulate her and thank her for the inspiration she had provided. Dr. Thornberry spoke about how Charlotte's actions had reminded everyone at the Royal Collection Trust about the human values that lay at the heart of their work preserving history and culture. "You've shown us all," Dr. Thornberry said warmly, "that the most important treasures in any collection are not the objects themselves, but the character and integrity of the people who care for them." Other palace staff members who had heard about Charlotte's story approached to offer their congratulations and to tell her how much her courage had meant to them. Several mentioned that they had children of their own and hoped that their sons and daughters would show similar courage when faced with difficult situations. As the afternoon drew to a close, Princess Anne made one final gesture that would remain in Charlotte's memory forever. She personally escorted Charlotte and Sarah to the palace garden, where they walked among the flowers and fountains while discussing the beauty of the grounds and the history of the buildings around them. "Charlotte," Princess Anne said as they paused beside a particularly beautiful rose bush, "I want you to remember something important. Today we've celebrated your courage, but the real celebration will come from how you choose to live your life going forward. True character isn't shown just once, it's shown every day, in small actions as well as large ones." "I understand, Your Royal Highness," Charlotte replied seriously. "Mama always says that being a good person is something you have to practice every day, like playing piano or learning to read." Princess Anne laughed delightedly at this comparison. "Your mother is absolutely right. And, based on what I've seen today, I have no doubt that you'll continue to practice being good with the same determination you showed in defending her." As they prepared to leave, Captain Morrison appeared once more to escort them to the palace gates. During their walk through the corridors, he shared his own reflections on the day's events. "Miss Charlotte," he said as they approached the main entrance, "today has been special for all of us, not just for you. You've reminded everyone here about why we do what we do and what values we're meant to serve and protect. Charlotte looked up at him with the same direct gaze she had used during their first encounter.
"Captain Morrison, will you remember me when I grow up?"
The captain smiled broadly. "My dear young lady, I can promise you that everyone who was here today will remember you for the rest of their lives. You've given us all a gift, the reminder that courage and character can come from anyone, at any age, when their heart is in the right place." As Charlotte and Sarah walked through the palace gates that afternoon, they carried with them not just the medallion and the photograph, but the knowledge that a 7-year-old girl's decision to stand up for what was right had touched hearts, inspired adults, and created a moment of recognition that was truly unprecedented in royal history. The story of Charlotte's courage would continue to be told for years to come, inspiring other children to find their own voices when faced with injustice, and reminding adults that the most profound lessons about character often come from the youngest and most honest among us. Her defense of her mother had begun as a simple act of loyalty, but it had evolved into something much greater, a demonstration of the power that lies within each person to make a difference when they choose to act with courage and integrity. In the years that followed, Charlotte would grow up carrying the lessons of that remarkable day with her, understanding that true honor comes not from titles or positions, but from the choices we make when it matters most. And, somewhere in the guardroom at Buckingham Palace, a photograph would continue to remind all who saw it that courage knows no age limit, and that sometimes the smallest voices can speak the loudest truths.